10 days. That's all it took for one of the most powerful military forces in history to go from confidence to uncertainty. Not defeat, not collapse, but something far more dangerous: doubt. Because here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud right now. If everything was going according to plan, why did the United States pick up the phone and call Russia? Why did Washington call Moscow? And more importantly, what does that tell us about how this war is really going? This is not just another Middle East conflict. This is something bigger, something deeper. And if you look closely at what happened in the last few days, you start to see a pattern that completely changes the story being told on the surface. Because what you're seeing on TV is not the full picture. Let's go back to the beginning. Less than 2 weeks ago, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called a massive operation. Hundreds of strikes in just hours. Advanced bombers, fighter jets, cruise missiles launched from the sea. It was fast, powerful, and designed to do one thing: shock the system. The idea was simple: take out the leadership, and the rest will collapse. In the first wave of attacks, Iran's top leadership was hit hard. The supreme leader was killed. Senior officials were eliminated. It was what experts call a decapitation strike, a move meant to break the structure of power from the top. And at first it looked like it worked. The assumption was that the Iranian system would fall apart quickly, that people inside the country, already frustrated after recent protests, would rise up, that the government would weaken, and that within days, it would all be over. That was the theory. But here's the problem. Reality didn't follow the theory. Because Iran didn't collapse, it responded. Within hours, missiles were launched across the region. Not just one or two, but waves. Targets included military bases, infrastructure, and key strategic locations across multiple countries. Drones filled the skies. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be a short conflict. And then came the move that changed everything. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you're wondering why that matters so much, let me break it down simply. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important waterways on the planet. Around 20% of the world's oil flows through that narrow passage every single day. Think about that. One narrow channel, carrying a fifth of the global energy supply. So when that gets shut down, it doesn't just affect one country, it affects everyone. Gas prices rise, shipping slows down, economies start to feel pressure, and that's exactly what happened. Ships stopped moving, insurance companies refused to cover routes through the area, tankers stayed parked instead of risking attack, and then oil prices exploded. This wasn't a slow increase, it was sharp, fast, almost vertical. Within days, the global market started reacting, prices jumped, uncertainty spread, and suddenly, what was supposed to be a quick military operation turned into something much bigger, a global economic issue. And here's where things get really interesting, because while the military campaign was still ongoing, something else started happening behind the scenes. Pressure, not just from outside, but from inside. Leaders now had to answer a different question. Not, are we winning the war, but, how long can we keep this going? Because wars are not just about power, they're about time, and time is expensive. Every day the conflict continues, the cost increases, not just in money, but in political pressure, public opinion, and global stability. And this is where the story shifts. Because now, instead of focusing only on military success, attention starts turning towards something else, an exit strategy. But here's the twist. At the same time all of this is happening, Iran is not backing down. Even after losing key leadership, even after facing heavy strikes, the country continues to respond, continues to launch missiles, continues to show resistance, which sends a very different message to the world. It says, this is not ending quickly, and when that realization starts to settle in, decisions begin to change. That's when the phone call happens, not from Moscow to Washington, but from Washington to Moscow. And that single detail might be the most important clue in this entire situation. Because in global politics, who makes the call matters. It shows urgency, it shows need, it shows who is looking for something, and in this case, it raises a serious question. What exactly is the United States looking for right now? Is it support? Is it mediation? Or is it a way out? Because when you combine everything, the rising oil prices, the ongoing strikes, the continued resistance, you start to see a different picture forming. A picture where the original plan didn't fully work. A picture where time is becoming the biggest challenge. And a picture where new players are stepping into the spotlight. Now here's where things get even more intense. Because the conversation between these global leaders is not just about one war. It's about multiple conflicts, multiple interests, and multiple deals happening at the same time. And if you think this is just about Iran, you're missing the bigger game. In the next part, we're going to break down that phone call. What was really discussed, why it matters, and how one conversation could change not just this war, but another major conflict happening at the same time. because what's happening behind closed doors might be more powerful than anything happening on the battlefield. Now let's zoom in on that moment. The phone call that changed the tone of everything, because at first glance it was described as something simple, routine, just two world leaders talking, exchanging views, staying in touch. But when you look deeper, nothing about this call was routine. Think about the timing. For months there had been silence between these two leaders, no urgent meetings, no constant communication, just distance. Then suddenly, just 10 days into a fast-moving and unpredictable war, that silence breaks, and not quietly. The call happens right when oil prices are rising, when global markets are shaking, and when the military situation is becoming harder to control. That's not coincidence, that's pressure, and in global politics, pressure creates movement. So what was really discussed? According to official statements, the conversation was frank and businesslike. That sounds normal, right? But in diplomatic language, those words often mean something else. They mean serious, they mean direct, and most importantly, they mean decisions are being shaped. The conversation reportedly lasted about an hour. That's not a quick check-in. That's a focused discussion. And during that time, proposals were put on the table, ideas for how this conflict could move towards some kind of resolution. But here's where it gets interesting. Those proposals weren't created in isolation. They were based on conversations with other regional players, including leaders from the Gulf and Iran's new leadership. So what does that tell us? It tells us that Russia was already talking to multiple sides, already building connections, already positioning itself in the middle of the situation. That's not just diplomacy, that's strategy, because when you are talking to everyone, you become important to everyone. And that's exactly what happened. Suddenly Russia is no longer just watching from the outside. It's becoming a key player in how this conflict might end. Now ask yourself this: if everything was going perfectly for the United States, would they need that kind of help? Probably not. And that's why this call matters so much, because it shows that something has shifted. Now let's go even deeper. After the call, public statements started coming out. Positive language, optimistic tone, words like very good call and productive discussion. But sometimes what's not said is more important than what is said. Because behind those positive phrases, there's a hidden message. We need movement. We need solutions. We need an outcome. And quickly. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex. Because this conversation wasn't just about one war. It also touched on another major conflict happening at the same time: Ukraine. Now think about that for a second. In the middle of a growing crisis in the Middle East, the discussion shifts to Eastern Europe. Why? Because everything is connected. Global politics is not a series of separate events. It's one big system, and decisions in one area affect outcomes in another. During the call, it was suggested that cooperation in one conflict could influence progress in another. That's a powerful idea. It means that what happens in the Middle East could shape what happens in Ukraine, and vice versa. This is no longer just about military operations. This is about negotiation, about leverage, about using one situation to influence another. And that's where the real game begins. Because when leaders start connecting different conflicts, they are no longer thinking short-term. They are thinking about deals, about trade-offs, about outcomes that go beyond a single battlefield. Now let's talk about leverage. In this situation, Russia holds something very valuable. It has relationships in the Middle East, it has influence with Iran, and it has a strong position in Ukraine. That's three major advantages. And when you combine them, you get something powerful: control over multiple outcomes at once. So when the phone rings and Washington is on the other side, asking for conversation, that gives Moscow a position of strength. Because now it's not just about listening, it's about negotiating. And negotiation always involves exchange. You give something to get something. So the big question becomes, what is being offered? What is being asked for? And what could the final deal look like? Because make no mistake, this is not just a conversation. This is the early stage of a deal being shaped in real time. And while all of this is happening behind closed doors, the situation on the ground continues. Missiles are still being launched, targets are still being hit, and tension is still rising, which creates a strange contrast. On one side, conflict. On the other side, negotiation. Two completely different directions happening at the same time. And that creates uncertainty. Because when a war is still active, but talks are already happening, it usually means one thing: an exit is being considered. Not announced, not confirmed, but considered. Now here's where it gets even more serious. Because while leaders are talking about solutions, the situation on the ground is not slowing down. In fact, in some areas, it's getting more intense. More strikes, more responses, more pressure. And this creates a dangerous balance. Because the longer the conflict continues, the harder it becomes to control the outcome. And the harder it becomes to sell any deal as a win. That's a key point. Because in modern politics, perception matters as much as reality. Leaders don't just need to end conflicts, they need to explain them. They need to present outcomes in a way that feels like success, even if the situation is more complicated than that. So now, the challenge becomes clear. How do you move from conflict to agreement without looking like you are stepping back? How do you create an ending that feels like victory, even if the original plan didn't fully succeed? That's the puzzle being solved right now, and the phone call we just discussed is one of the first major steps in solving it. But here's the part most people are missing. While all of this negotiation is happening, one side in this conflict is not showing any signs of stopping, not slowing down, and that changes everything. Because if one side keeps pushing, then every deal becomes harder to make, every agreement becomes more fragile, and every outcome becomes more uncertain. Now let's focus on the side that was supposed to fall, but didn't. Because this is where the entire story takes a sharp turn. From the very beginning, the expectation was clear. Once the leadership was gone, once the strikes hit hard enough, the system would weaken, maybe even collapse. But instead of collapsing, it adapted. And that changes everything. Because in modern warfare, survival is power. If you can absorb damage and still respond, you send a message to your opponent and to the world that you are not done yet. And that is exactly what we are seeing here. Even after losing key figures, even after facing one of the most intense air campaigns in recent history, the response has not stopped. Missiles are still being launched. Targets are still being selected. And perhaps most importantly, the tone has not changed. There has been no sign of surrender, no signal of backing down. Instead, the message has been consistent. We are still here. Now pause for a second and think about what that means. Because this is not just about military capability. This is about strategy. There are two ways to read what's happening right now. The first is the optimistic view, that the strikes have reduced the ability to respond, that resources are running low, that the intensity will fade over time. But there is a second view, a more strategic one, that what looks like a slowdown is actually control. That instead of using everything at once, the response is being managed, timed, calculated, not a collapse, but a pacing strategy. And if that's true, then this conflict is not near its end. It's just entering a different phase, a longer phase. And that is exactly what makes this situation so dangerous. Because long conflicts don't just test military strength, they test patience, they test economies, they test political stability. And right now, all three are being pushed at the same time. Let's talk about the economy for a moment. Because while missiles grab headlines, money moves quietly in the background and often tells the real story. With the Strait of Hormuz disrupted, the global oil flow has taken a hit. And when energy supply becomes uncertain, markets react immediately. Prices go up, confidence goes down, and pressure builds. This is not just a regional issue anymore, this is global. Every country that depends on energy feels it. Every industry that relies on transportation feels it. And every government has to respond to it. Now connect that back to the war. The longer the disruption continues, the more pressure builds, not just on one side, but on everyone involved. And that pressure creates urgency. Urgency to act, urgency to negotiate, urgency to find a way out. But here's the problem. You can't negotiate easily with someone who doesn't feel the same pressure. And right now, one side appears ready for a longer fight, which creates imbalance. And imbalance makes deals harder. Now let's bring another player into this picture. Because while these two sides are engaged directly, there's someone else watching very closely. Someone who is not just observing, but benefiting. And that's Russia. From a strategic point of view, this situation offers multiple advantages. First, attention shifts. When a major conflict starts in one region, global focus moves. Resources move, priorities change, and that can create space in other areas. Second, markets shift. With oil routes disrupted, alternative suppliers become more important, and that creates opportunity. Opportunity for influence, opportunity for profit, opportunity for positioning. And third, leverage increases. Because when you are connected to multiple sides, and those sides are under pressure, your importance grows. You become the middle point, the bridge, the negotiator. And that's exactly what we're seeing develop right now. Now think back to that phone call again. It wasn't just about talking, it was about positioning. It was about creating a situation where one side becomes essential to the outcome. And once you reach that point, you gain power without firing a single shot. That's the deeper layer of this story. Because while one war is being fought in the open, another is being played quietly, in meetings, in conversations, in negotiations. And that second war often decides the final result. Now let's shift back to the ground reality. Because beyond strategy, beyond markets, beyond politics, there are real consequences. Lives are being lost, communities are being affected, infrastructure is being damaged. And with every passing day, the cost increases, not just financially, but humanly. And that adds another layer of pressure. Because at some point, the question changes. It's no longer just about winning, it becomes about stopping the damage, about limiting the loss, about finding a point where both sides can step back. But stepping back is not easy, especially when both sides are still active, still responding, still sending signals of strength. That's what makes this moment so critical. Because everything is happening at once, conflict is continuing, pressure is increasing, and negotiations are beginning. And when all three of those things happen at the same time, the outcome becomes unpredictable. Now here's the key insight you need to understand. This war is no longer just about territory, it's about time. Who can last longer? Who can manage pressure better? Who can control the narrative? And who can shape the final deal? Because in the end, wars don't just end with victory or defeat. They end with agreements, with terms, with outcomes that are presented to the world in a certain way. And right now, those terms are being built, quietly, behind closed doors, while the world watches the explosions on the surface. So as we move into the final part, there's one big question we need to answer. How does this end? What does victory actually look like in this situation? And who walks away with the most advantage? Because the answer to that question might not be what you expect.